The glass of wine hit Clara Ashworth's gown before she even saw it coming, and the ballroom went silent for one long, terrible breath. "Oh dear," said Lady Priscilla Hartley, her voice pitched loud enough to carry to every corner of the grand hall. "How clumsy of you, Miss Ashworth, though I suppose a woman raised without proper manners cannot be expected to hold herself with any grace." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Not everyone laughed, but enough did, and that was worse than if all of them had. Clara felt the wine soak through the silk at her waist, cold and spreading, and she felt something else too, something colder still, the weight of 200 pairs of eyes turning toward her at once. She had not spilled anything. She had been standing perfectly still near the refreshment table, speaking to no one, when Priscilla's hand had struck the glass from a passing footman's tray and sent it flying, as though it were an accident, as though the whole room had not seen the flick of her wrist. But no one said that. No one dared correct a woman like Priscilla Hartley, daughter of an earl, favored guest of half the great houses in the city, and so the lie stood, and Clara stood beneath it, feeling her face burn. "Perhaps," Priscilla went on, circling her slowly, the way a cat circles something it intends to toy with before it grows bored. "Miss Ashworth ought to have stayed home this evening. Some of us were simply not raised for company such as this." More laughter. A cluster of young men near the pillars did not bother to hide their smirks. An older woman fanned herself and murmured something to her companion, and though Clara could not hear the words, she could guess their shape well enough from the woman's expression. Clara's hands trembled at her sides. She wanted, more than she had ever wanted anything, to simply vanish, to become smoke and slip out through the tall windows into the dark garden beyond, away from every staring face in this room. But her feet would not move. Shame has a way of rooting a person to the floor, of making the distance to the nearest door feel like a mile. She thought of her mother, waiting at home in their small rented rooms, who had spent the last of their savings on the dressmaker so that Clara might attend tonight and perhaps, just perhaps, catch the eye of some respectable family who did not know how far the Ashworth name had fallen. She thought of the months of careful smiles and careful words that had gotten her this single invitation, this one chance to be seen as something other than a poor relation living on the edge of society's mercy. And now it was over. Whatever chance she'd had, Priscilla had just crushed it in front of everyone who mattered. "I only meant to enjoy the evening," Clara said, and hated how thin her voice sounded, how it barely reached beyond her own ears. "Of course you did," Priscilla said sweetly, and there was nothing sweet in it at all. "We all understand. It cannot be easy, coming from nothing, trying so very hard to appear as though you belong among us. Truly, it's almost admirable, almost." The laughter swelled again. Clara felt tears gathering behind her eyes, hot and humiliating, and she blinked hard against them, refusing to let this woman see her cry, refusing to give Priscilla that final victory on top of everything else. It was then that the room changed. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the air, a sudden hush that spread outward from the far end of the hall like ripples on still water. Voices dropped, fans stopped their fluttering. Even Priscilla's smile faltered for just a moment as she glanced past Clara's shoulder toward whatever had caused such a stir. Clara turned and saw him. Duke Alaric Vane moved through the crowd the way a blade moves through silk, without hesitation, without apparent effort, and yet everyone in his path seemed to part before he reached them, as though some instinct warned them not to stand too close. He was tall, dressed in unrelieved black but for the silver at his collar, and his face wore the same expression it always wore in public, distant, unreadable, faintly contemptuous of the entire spectacle around him. Clara had heard of him, of course. Everyone had. The Duke of Camden was spoken of in hushed, careful tones, a man who had inherited his title young and cold, who attended society functions rarely and left them early, who was rumored to have ended more than one man standing in the city with nothing more than a well-placed word. He did not attend balls to dance. He attended them, when he attended at all, to observe, and his observations were said to be dangerous. He had never, in Clara's hearing, spoken to anyone below the rank of Viscount. And yet here he was, crossing the floor directly toward her, while the entire ballroom watched in stunned silence. Priscilla straightened, her earlier confidence flickering into something uncertain. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a hasty curtsy. "What a pleasant surprise." I saw what you were just," the Duke said, and his voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence of the room more sharply than a shout could have. "I saw you strike the glass from that footman's hand. I saw you do it, and then paint this young woman as its cause." A murmur went through the crowd, disbelief and delight tangled together, the particular hunger of people who sense a much better scandal unfolding than the one they'd been enjoying a moment before. Priscilla's face went pale, then red. "Your Grace, I assure you, you must be mistaken." "I am not in the habit of being mistaken," he said. "Nor am I in the habit of watching a lie stand unchallenged, simply because it is convenient for the room to believe it." He turned then, and for the first time, looked directly at Clara. His eyes were a pale, cold gray, and she braced herself for the same contempt she'd seen him show everyone else that evening. Instead, there was something else in his gaze, something she could not quite name, and it unsettled her more than his reputation ever had. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and the sound of her own name in his mouth, spoken evenly, without mockery, nearly undid her composure entirely. "Your gown is ruined. Allow me to see that it is replaced, and allow me to escort you for the remainder of the evening, so that no one else mistakes an insult for an accident." The room did not simply murmur this time. It erupted. Quiet gasps and quick, urgent whispers passing from shoulder to shoulder, spreading outward faster than Clara could track. She understood, distantly, that whatever had just happened would be the talk of the city by morning, that she had gone from an object of humiliation to an object of fascination in the space of a single sentence. "Your Grace," she managed. "You needn't. I couldn't possibly ask." "You did not ask," he said. "I am offering. There is a difference." He extended his arm, an old-fashioned gesture, formal and precise, and waited. Clara looked at that arm, black sleeve and pale hand, and looked past it to Priscilla, who stood frozen in humiliation now herself. The tables turned so suddenly and so completely that she seemed unable to process it. She looked at the crowd, at all those faces that had laughed at her only minutes ago, now watching her with something closer to awe. She thought of her mother again, of the dressmaker's bill, of every careful hope she'd carried into this room. None of it had prepared her for this. Slowly she reached out and placed her hand on the Duke's arm. The moment her fingers touched his sleeve, something in the crowd's murmuring changed pitch entirely, rising into a kind of astonished hum, and Clara understood that whatever safety this offered her tonight, it would come with a price. No one extended themselves for nothing, and certainly not a man like the Duke of Camden, whose reputation for coldness was matched only by his reputation for calculation. But for now, in this moment, his arm was steady beneath her hand, and the ballroom that had turned against her only minutes before now watched her walk beside the most powerful, most feared man in the city. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly she wasn't certain he had heard. He glanced down at her, and for just a moment, something almost gentle crossed his features before the coldness settled back into place. "Do not thank me yet, Miss Ashworth," he said. "You do not yet know what you have agreed to." And with that he led her forward, past Priscilla's stricken face, past the whispering crowd, into a night that Clara understood, with sudden and absolute certainty, would change everything. They walked the length of the ballroom together, and Clara felt every eye in the room follow them, felt the weight of 100 silent questions pressing against her back. She kept her chin lifted, though her heart pounded so hard she feared he might feel it trembling through her fingertips on his arm. Whatever else this night had done to her, it had also taught her something about herself, that she could stand beneath the worst of stares and still walk forward without breaking. Near the far doors, an older woman in deep blue silk stepped forward and offered a small, careful curtsy, not to Clara, but in Clara's direction, as though testing whether such a gesture was now permitted. The Duke gave the faintest nod, and the woman's shoulders relaxed, and Clara understood in that instant just how quickly the currents of this world could shift. An hour ago she had been beneath notice. Now she was worth a curtsy, simply because of whose arm she stood beside. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt strange and unsteady, like standing on a floor that might tilt again at any moment. "You are quiet," the Duke observed, as they reached the edge of the dance floor, where the orchestra had begun again, filling the hall with music as though nothing at all had happened. "I am trying to understand why you did that," Clara admitted. "You do not know me, Your Grace. You have never spoken a word to me before tonight. I know a lie when I see one told in a crowded room," he said, "and I know what it costs a person to stand beneath it and say nothing, because I have done so myself, more than once, in rooms very much like this one." There was something in the way he said it, some old and guarded weight beneath the words, that told Clara there was far more to that sentence than he intended to share tonight. She did not press him. She sensed, somehow, that pressing would only make him retreat further behind that cold, careful mask he wore so easily. Across the room, Priscilla had gathered herself enough to whisper furiously with two of her companions, casting sharp glances toward Clara that promised this was far from finished. Clara noticed, and felt a small cold knot form in her stomach. A woman like Priscilla Hartley did not forgive a public humiliation, especially not one delivered by the most powerful man in the city, in defense of a woman she had chosen to mock. "She will not let this go," Clara said quietly. "No," the Duke agreed. "She will not. Which is precisely why you must not walk through the rest of this evening alone." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet somehow held her still. "I meant what I said, Miss Ashworth. You do not yet know what you have agreed to, by taking my arm tonight. But I intend to make certain you are never humiliated in a ballroom again, not while I have any power to prevent it." Clara searched his face for some sign of mockery, some hint that this was merely another game played by the powerful at the expense of the powerless, but she found none. Only that same steady, unreadable calm, and beneath it, something that looked almost like the echo of an old wound. The music swelled around them, and somewhere behind her, she heard her name spoken again and again, in hushed, curious voices, no longer cruel, but hungry for a story they did not yet understand. Clara Ashworth, poor relation, humiliated and rescued in the same breath, standing now beside the Duke of Camden as though she belonged there. She did not know, not yet, whether she did. But for the first time since she had walked into this ballroom, she allowed herself to breathe. The carriage rolled to a stop outside a townhouse Clara had never seen before, tall and dark against the night sky, and only then did she realize how far the Duke had brought her from the ballroom, and how little she actually knew about the man sitting across from her. "This is not my mother's house," she said carefully. "No," the Duke said, "it is mine. I thought it wiser to speak somewhere Priscilla Hartley cannot listen through a half-open door." Clara's pulse quickened, not entirely from fear. "Your Grace, I must return home. My mother will worry." "I have already sent word to her," he said. "A note, explaining that you are safe and will return within the hour. I did not think it fair to leave her waiting without knowledge of where you'd gone." That single detail, small and practical, softened something in Clara's chest more than any grand gesture could have. A man capable of silencing an entire ballroom with a sentence had also thought, in the middle of that chaos, to spare her mother a night of fear. She followed him inside. The study he led her to was warm, lined with books, a fire already burning low in the hearth. He gestured for her to sit, and took the chair opposite rather than looming over her, which she noted and appreciated more than she let herself show. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for what I did tonight, and for what I am about to ask of you." Clara folded her hands in her lap. "I am listening." "Priscilla Hartley's family and mine have been at odds for years," he began. "Her father, the Earl of Dunmore, holds a debt of honor against my own father that was never properly settled before his death. Priscilla has spent the last 2 seasons attempting to force a marriage between us, believing it would resolve the matter in her family's favor and secure her position permanently. I have refused her, repeatedly, and each refusal has made her more determined and more dangerous to anyone she perceives as standing in her way. And tonight she saw me as an easy target," Clara said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "Not because of anything I did. Because she needed someone to humiliate, and I was standing close enough." "Partly," the Duke admitted, "though I suspect there was more to it than convenience. Priscilla does not simply strike out at random. She chooses her targets with care, and there is usually a reason behind her choosing, even if that reason is not yet visible to us." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling night outside. What reason could she possibly have against me? I have never spoken more than a dozen words to that woman in my life. "That," the Duke said, "is precisely what troubles me, which brings me to what I wish to propose." He rose and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment Clara studied his profile against the firelight, the sharp line of his jaw, the careful stillness of a man who had trained himself never to show more than he intended. "I propose an engagement," he said. "Not a true one, not yet, but an understanding announced publicly, sufficient to place you under my protection in the eyes of society. Priscilla will not dare move against a woman I have publicly claimed to favor, not without risking my full retaliation. And my retaliation, Miss Ashworth, tends to be thorough." Clara stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You are asking me to pretend to be engaged to you." "I am asking you to allow the appearance of it, yes. Nothing would be expected of you beyond appearing at my side at certain occasions, until such time as the danger from Priscilla has passed, or until we discover what truly lies beneath her hostility toward you." "And if I refuse? Then I will find some other way to protect you," he said, turning to face her fully now. "But I will tell you honestly, Miss Ashworth, that other way will be far less effective, and far more likely to leave you exposed to whatever Priscilla intends next. Clara sat with that for a long moment, turning it over. Every instinct her mother had carefully instilled in her screamed caution, warned her that a man's convenient offer rarely came without hidden cost, that agreeing to such an arrangement could ruin what little reputation she had left, far more thoroughly than Priscilla's cruelty ever could. And yet beneath that caution ran something else, a thread of curiosity she could not quite silence, a wondering about what had made this cold, guarded Duke choose to step into her defense at all. "Why me?" she asked finally. "You could have simply corrected Priscilla and walked away. You did not need to offer anything further. Why go to such lengths for a woman you had never spoken to before tonight?" Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and guarded, gone almost before she could name it. "Because I watched you stand beneath a lie you did not deserve, and refused to give the room the satisfaction of your tears," he said. "I have seen a great many people break under far less. You did not break. That is not nothing, Miss Ashworth. That is in fact rather rare." The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than she had expected from a man of his reputation, and Clara found herself studying him with new attention, searching for the person beneath the cold exterior the city had built around him in whispers and rumor. "There is something else," he added, after a pause, "something I should tell you before you decide." "Go on." "My own reputation is not simply the product of temperament," he said. "There was a woman, some years ago, who I trusted with more than I should have. She used that trust to advance her family's interests at my expense, and very nearly succeeded in ruining me before I understood what she was doing. Since then I have made a point of trusting no one easily, and showing the world as little of myself as possible. I tell you this not to burden you with my history, but so you understand exactly what kind of man you would be aligning yourself with. I am not easy to know, Miss Ashworth. I doubt I ever will be." Clara considered this confession, offered so plainly by a man who clearly did not offer such things often, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, some wariness easing into cautious understanding. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "It does not change my answer, but I am glad to know it." "And your answer?" She drew a slow breath, thinking of Priscilla's cold smile, of the debt her mother could not afford, of the strange, steady calm she felt now in this quiet study, so different from the panic that had gripped her in the ballroom only an hour before. "I will agree," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "That you tell me the truth, always, even when it is inconvenient. I have spent enough of my life being managed and maneuvered by people who thought me too foolish or too powerless to deserve honesty. I will not enter into any arrangement, false or otherwise, built on anything less." For the first time since she had met him, the Duke's mouth curved into something that was almost, though not quite, a smile. "That," he said, "I believe I can promise." They shook on it, an oddly formal gesture between two people about to announce a false engagement to all of society, and Clara felt the weight of what she had just agreed to settle over her shoulders. She did not yet know whether she had just saved herself, or walked willingly into a far greater danger than Priscilla Hartley had ever posed. But as the Duke called for the carriage to take her home, and helped her into her cloak with unexpected gentleness, she found herself thinking not of Priscilla's cruelty, nor of the whispers that would surely follow her for weeks to come, but of the quiet honesty in his voice when he had spoken of the woman who betrayed him, and the strange, unfamiliar warmth that honesty had stirred in her. The carriage ride home passed in comfortable silence, broken only once, as they neared her street, when the Duke spoke again. "Miss Ashworth, Your Grace? Whatever comes of this arrangement, know that my protection was never conditional on your agreement tonight. I would have found some way to shield you from Priscilla regardless. I simply believed you deserved to choose how, rather than have it decided for you, as so much else in your life clearly has been." Clara looked at him in the dim carriage light, surprised again by this man who kept revealing small, unexpected kindnesses beneath his cold reputation, and felt, for the first time that night, something other than fear or gratitude. She felt curiosity, sharp and undeniable, about who Duke Alaric Vane truly was beneath the mask the city had built for him. "Thank you," she said again, and this time her voice did not waver at all. When the carriage stopped before her mother's modest door, he stepped down first and offered his hand to help her descend, and stood watching until she had safely reached the threshold. Only then did he return to the carriage, and only then did Clara allow herself to lean against the closed door and press a hand to her racing heart, wondering what exactly she had just begun, and whether she was ready for wherever it might lead. Inside, she found her mother waiting by the small fire in the sitting room, still dressed, a shawl clutched tight around her shoulders despite the warmth of the flames, Margaret Ashworth rose the moment the door opened, her face pale with the particular worry of a woman who had spent years bracing for bad news. "His note said you were safe," her mother said, crossing the room quickly. "But it said nothing else, Clara. And I have been sitting here imagining every terrible possibility for the better part of an hour. What happened? Why would the Duke of Camden himself send word about my daughter?" Clara sank onto the small settee, suddenly aware of how tired she was, how much had happened since she had left this room only a few hours earlier, full of hope and careful optimism for the evening ahead. She told her mother everything: the wine, the laughter, Priscilla's cruel smile, and then the sudden hush that had fallen over the ballroom as the Duke crossed the floor toward her. Margaret listened without interrupting, her hands twisting slowly in her lap, and when Clara reached the part about the study, the fire, the proposal of a false engagement, her mother's face shifted through several expressions at once: fear, disbelief, and finally something more careful and considering. "A false engagement," Margaret repeated slowly. "To the Duke of Camden. Only in appearance," Clara said. "Only until the danger from Lady Priscilla has passed." "Clara," her mother took both her hands, gripping them tightly. "Do you understand what you have agreed to? If this arrangement becomes known as false, if anyone discovers the truth of it, you will not simply lose your place in society. You will lose it forever, and take our family name down with you. There will be no recovering from a scandal of that size." "I know," Clara said quietly. "I thought of that, sitting in his study. But mother, if I had refused him, what then? Lady Priscilla was not finished with me tonight. She will not simply let this go because I declined his offer. I would have walked out of that house with no protection at all, and she would have found some new way to strike at me before the week was through." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire, and when she spoke again, her voice had softened, though the worry had not left it entirely. "Your father would have told you to be careful of powerful men who offer easy solutions," she said. "He always believed the easiest path was usually the one with the steepest cost hidden somewhere along it." "I remember," Clara said. "But father is not here to advise me, and I must decide these things for myself now, as I have had to decide most things since he passed." She said it gently, without bitterness, though the truth of it sat heavy between them, as it always did. Her mother's eyes glistened, and she pressed Clara's hands once more before releasing them. "Then I will trust your judgment," she said, "though I confess it frightens me, watching you walk into the company of a man the whole city fears. Just promise me you will be careful, Clara. Promise me you will not let yourself believe in kindness from a man, simply because he has shown you a moment of it. Kindness can be a strategy as easily as cruelty can." Clara thought of the Duke's quiet confession in the study, the woman who had betrayed his trust years before, the careful honesty in his voice when he warned her he was not easy to know. She thought too of the small, unexpected gesture of sending word to her mother, sparing her hours of fear, a kindness that had cost him nothing to withhold and everything to offer. "I will be careful," she promised, though even as she said it, she wondered whether it was a promise she could truly keep, given how quickly her curiosity about the Duke had already begun to outpace her caution. That night, long after her mother had retired and the house had gone quiet, Clara lay awake staring at the low ceiling of her small room, turning the evening over and over in her mind. She thought of Priscilla's cruel smile curdling into shock, of the sudden hush across the ballroom, of the strange, steady warmth in the Duke's pale gray eyes when he had asked her not to thank him yet. She did not know what the coming weeks would bring, whether this fragile arrangement would protect her as he promised, or draw her into dangers far greater than a spilled glass of wine and a cruel woman's tongue. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she did not regret placing her hand upon his arm tonight. Whatever came next, she told herself, she would face it with her eyes open, and her wits about her, and not one drop of the same weakness Priscilla Hartley had tried so hard to paint upon her in front of the entire ballroom. The letter arrived 3 days later, slipped beneath the front door sometime before dawn, and Clara's hands shook as she broke the seal, because she recognized the handwriting at once, the same careful, spiteful script that had once decorated invitations she'd never received. "You think a Duke's charity will save you," the letter read. "It will not. Everyone falls eventually, Miss Ashworth. I intend to watch you fall from a very great height." There was no signature, but none was needed. Clara folded the letter with trembling fingers and hid it in the bottom of her writing desk, unwilling to burden her mother with one more worry so soon after the last. She had not seen the Duke since that night in his study, though the city had spoken of little else. The announcement of their understanding, carefully worded and placed by the Duke's own solicitor, had spread through every drawing room and card table within a day, And Clara had felt the shift in how people looked at her ever since. Curiosity replacing contempt, careful courtesy replacing careless cruelty. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, it felt like standing on ice that had not yet decided whether it would hold her weight. The Duke sent word that afternoon, requesting she join him for a walk in the public gardens, where enough witnesses would ensure the arrangement continued to appear genuine. Clara dressed carefully, tucking Priscilla's letter into her reticule, uncertain whether she meant to show it to him or simply could not bear to leave it behind in an empty house. He was waiting beneath the old oak near the garden's entrance when she arrived, dressed less formally than she had yet seen him, though no less commanding for it. Something in his expression sharpened the moment he saw her face. "Something has happened," he said, before she had even reached him. "How do you know?" "You are holding your reticule as though it contains something you are afraid will escape," he said. "Tell me." She handed him the letter without a word, and watched his jaw tighten as he read it, watched the cold, careful mask he wore in public settle over his features like armor closing into place. "This is not simply spite," he said finally. "This is a threat, and a specific one. She would not risk putting words like these to paper unless she believed she had already found her weapon against you." "What could she possibly have found?" Clara asked. "I have no secrets, Your Grace. My life has been too small and too careful to hide anything worth discovering." "Everyone has something," he said, though not unkindly. "A debt unpaid, a connection best forgotten, a choice made in desperation that seemed harmless at the time. Tell me about your father, Miss Ashworth. How did your family come to its present circumstances?" Clara stiffened, old grief rising sharp and sudden at the question, though she understood the necessity of it. "My father was a merchant," she said. "A moderately successful one, though never wealthy enough to secure our place among the families we now find ourselves circling at the edges of. He invested poorly in his final years, trusting a partner who proved dishonest, and died believing he had ruined us. My mother has spent every year since trying to prove him wrong, in her own quiet way." "And the partner? Do you know his name?" Clara frowned, searching her memory for a name she had heard only rarely, always spoken with bitterness by her mother in the years just after her father's death. "Hartley," she said slowly, as the realization dawned with sickening clarity. "His name was Edmund Hartley." The Duke's expression darkened. "Priscilla's uncle," he said, "her father's younger brother." The pieces settled into place with the terrible weight of inevitability. "She did not simply choose me at random that night," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She knew who I was. She has known all along." "It would seem so," the Duke agreed, "which means her hostility toward you was never truly about wine spilled on a gown, or manners, or anything so trivial. It is about whatever debt or grievance still lingers between your family and hers, something significant enough that she has chosen to pursue it years after your father's death, and significant enough that she now sees fit to threaten you directly." Clara sat heavily on the stone bench beneath the oak, feeling the ground she had only just begun to find beneath her feet shift once more. What could my father possibly have taken from the Hartleys, that they would still hold it against a family as broken as mine, all these years later? "That," the Duke said, lowering himself beside her, "is precisely what we must discover, before Priscilla decides to act on her threat rather than simply write it." They sat together in silence for a long moment, the garden's quiet birdsong strangely peaceful against the weight of what they had just uncovered. Clara studied the Duke's profile, the careful stillness he wore even now, and found herself wondering how much of his composure was truly calm, and how much was simply years of practice at concealing whatever storm moved beneath the surface. "You said that first night that you knew what it cost to stand beneath a lie and say nothing," she said quietly. "The woman who betrayed you, was her name Hartley as well?" Something flickered across his face, quick and guarded, before he answered. "No," he said. "But she was known to the Hartley family. Priscilla's cousin, in fact, though a connection more distant than the uncle you've just named. It is, I confess, part of why I did not hesitate to step forward that night in the ballroom. I recognized the particular cruelty of that family's methods the moment I saw Priscilla circling you." Clara absorbed this new piece of the puzzle carefully, understanding now that the Duke's intervention had never been entirely about her, that some old debt of his own had walked into that ballroom wearing her humiliation as its opening move. She did not resent it, exactly. But it clarified something she had wondered since that first night, why a man so guarded had acted so swiftly on behalf of a stranger. "Then we are both entangled in whatever the Hartleys are truly after," she said, "not merely by circumstance, but by history." "It would seem so," he agreed. which means we cannot simply wait for Priscilla's next move. We must learn what she believes she holds against you, before she decides the ballroom was only her opening move. Over the following days, the Duke set his own resources toward the question, quietly making inquiries among old solicitors and men of business who had known her father in his final years. Clara, for her part, searched through what few papers her mother had kept from that period. Old letters and ledgers stored in a trunk beneath the stairs that neither of them had opened in years. It was in that trunk, on the fourth evening, that she found it. A letter in her father's own hand, dated only weeks before his death, addressed to a man named Edmund Hartley, and never sent. "I know what you have done," the letter read, "and I know that exposing it would ruin us both, though only one of our families has anything left worth protecting. I will not speak of it, for my daughter's sake, though it costs me every night's sleep to hold my silence. But know this, Edmund. I have kept proof, and should any harm ever come to my family through your hand or your brother's, that proof will find its way into the light, whatever the cost to either of us." Clara read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to breathe normally again. Proof, her father had written. Proof of something significant enough that a merchant on the edge of ruin had chosen silence over justice, believing it the safer path for his family. But if such proof existed, where had it gone? And did Priscilla, or her uncle, know that it might still be out there somewhere, waiting to surface? She brought the letter to the Duke the following morning, watching his expression sharpen with the same intensity she'd seen the day he read Priscilla's threat. "This changes everything," he said, reading it a second time, more slowly. "Your father did not simply lose money to a dishonest partner, Miss Ashworth. He uncovered something Edmund Hartley desperately needed hidden, something significant enough to risk his own family's ruin rather than reveal it. And if such proof still exists somewhere among your father's belongings, then Priscilla's threat against you was never truly about revenge for an old debt. It was about finding that proof before you do, and silencing you before you understand what you might hold." Clara felt the full weight of the danger settle over her at last, cold and undeniable. "She does not simply wish to humiliate me," she said slowly. "She wishes to discover what I know, and prevent me from ever using it." "Yes," the Duke said grimly. "Which means, Miss Ashworth, that our arrangement has become considerably more dangerous than either of us anticipated on the night we made it. I must ask you plainly, do you wish to continue forward, knowing what we now know? Or would you prefer I find some quieter way to shield you, and let this old matter between our families remain buried?" Clara thought of her father's final years, the quiet grief that had shadowed him, the silence he had chosen to protect a family he loved even as it cost him his peace. She thought of her mother, still working to prove a dead man's failures wrong, never knowing the truth had been so much larger and more dangerous than simple poor judgment. "No," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to know what he was protecting us from. I want to understand what cost my father his final years of peace. And if there is proof somewhere that could expose the truth of what the Hartleys did to him, I want to find it, whatever the danger." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into his cold gray eyes. "Then we will find it together," he said. "But I must warn you, Miss Ashworth, Priscilla will not simply write threatening letters forever. If she believes you are close to uncovering the truth, she will act, and act decisively. We have very little time before this becomes far more dangerous than either of us can easily control." Clara nodded, folding her father's letter carefully back into its envelope, feeling for the first time since that humiliating night in the ballroom that she was no longer simply reacting to whatever cruelty came her way. She was, at last, beginning to fight back. Outside the window, evening was settling over the city, and somewhere across that same skyline, in a townhouse far grander than her mother's modest rooms, Clara knew that Priscilla Hartley was almost certainly plotting her next move, unaware that the woman she had chosen to destroy had just found the first thread of a truth that might unravel everything the Hartley family had spent years trying to keep buried. That night, Clara returned home and went straight to the trunk beneath the stairs, determined to search every remaining page for some clue as to what proof her father might have kept, and where he might have hidden it. Her mother found her there an hour later, surrounded by old ledgers and letters, dust smudged across her sleeves. "You found something," Margaret said, not a question, settling onto the floor beside her daughter, with the careful stiffness of a woman unused to sitting on bare boards. Clara showed her the unsent letter, watched her mother's face pale as she read it, watched old grief and new understanding war across her features in the candlelight. "I always believed your father simply trusted the wrong man," Margaret whispered. "I never imagined he had uncovered something Edmund Hartley would go to such lengths to hide." "Do you remember anything else from that time?" Clara asked gently. Any papers he kept separate from the rest? Any place he might have trusted to hide something important? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with the particular care of a woman reaching back through years of grief to retrieve a memory she had not needed in a long while. There was a strongbox, she said slowly. Small, iron, kept in his study. I assumed it held nothing but old business papers, and when the bailiffs came after his death to assess what little we had left, I never thought to mention it, because it seemed to hold nothing of value to anyone but him. I do not know what became of it. I believe it may still be with your Uncle Walter, who took what furniture and papers we could not keep when we moved to these rooms. Hope, cautious and fragile, rose in Clara's chest for the first time in days. Uncle Walter still has it? He may, Margaret said, though I could not say for certain what remains inside, or whether it was ever opened. The following morning, Clara sent word to the Duke, and within the hour his carriage arrived to take her across the city to her uncle's modest house on the far side of the river, a journey she would once have thought too great a favor to ask of anyone, and yet the Duke offered it without hesitation, as though such assistance cost him nothing at all. Her uncle, a quiet, weathered man who had done what little he could for his sister's family since her husband's death, listened to Clara's careful explanation with growing concern, and led them without argument to a dusty attic room where several old crates remained, untouched since the day they had been carried up those narrow stairs years before. It took the better part of an hour, sorting through crates of forgotten ledgers and moth-eaten linens, before Clara's fingers finally closed around cold iron, tucked beneath a false bottom in the third crate they searched. The strongbox was smaller than she had imagined, its lock rusted nearly shut, and her uncle produced an old key ring, testing keys with patient determination until one, finally, turned with a reluctant groan. Inside lay a small bundle of papers, yellowed with age, tied with a ribbon that had once been blue and was now faded nearly to gray. Clara's hands trembled as she untied it, and the Duke leaned close, his presence steady beside her as she unfolded the first page. It was a ledger, written in a hand she did not recognize, detailing sums of money moved through accounts that bore no relation to any legitimate business Clara had ever heard named. Beneath it lay a second document, a signed statement from a bank clerk long since retired, describing funds diverted from an investment pool that had once included her father's modest savings alongside contributions from several other merchant families, funds that had somehow vanished into private accounts controlled by Edmund Hartley, while investors were told the venture itself had simply failed. He did not lose the money to poor judgment, Clara said slowly, understanding dawning with a bitterness that surprised her with its sharpness. It was stolen, all of it. My father did not fail his family, Your Grace. He was robbed by a man who then let the entire city believe him a fool for trusting the wrong partner. And Edmund Hartley has spent every year since protecting his family's reputation on the ruins of your father's, the Duke said grimly, his own voice tight with barely contained anger. This is more than proof of a private grievance, Miss Ashworth. This is evidence of fraud, committed against multiple families, and covered by years of careful lies. If this were made public, it would not simply restore your father's name. It would end whatever remains of the Hartley family standing in this city entirely. Clara sat back on her heels, the weight of the discovery settling over her slowly, layer by layer. This was no longer simply about surviving Priscilla's cruelty, or maintaining the fragile fiction of an engagement to secure her own safety. This was about her father's name, stolen and buried beneath years of quiet shame he had carried alone, rather than risk his family's ruin by speaking the truth. We must be careful, the Duke said, gathering the papers with careful hands and returning them to the strongbox. If Priscilla or her uncle learn that you have found this before we are prepared to use it properly, they will not hesitate to act against you directly, and swiftly. This proof is powerful, Miss Ashworth, but only if it survives long enough to reach the right hands. Clara nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead, imagining the confrontation to come, the reckoning that had waited 11 long years to arrive at her father's grave, and finally set his name right. Whatever danger still lay ahead, she found she was no longer simply afraid of it. For the first time since that humiliating night in the ballroom, she felt something sharper and steadier settling into place beneath her fear. She felt ready to fight for the truth, whatever it cost her. 3 days after the strongbox surfaced from her uncle's attic, Clara found herself standing in the Duke's study once more, this time not as a stranger seeking shelter, but as something closer to a partner in the careful, dangerous work of building a case against a family that had ruined her father, and nearly ruined the Duke's own trust in anyone at all. We cannot simply hand these papers to a magistrate, the Duke explained, spreading the documents across his desk with careful precision. Edmund Hartley has spent years cultivating friendships among men of influence, and his brother the Earl holds enough sway to bury an accusation before it ever reaches a proper hearing, unless we present it in a manner that leaves him no room to maneuver. Then what do you propose? Clara asked, studying the ledger with fresh eyes, searching each line for some detail she might have missed before. A public reckoning, he said. Not a quiet legal proceeding that can be smothered behind closed doors, but an unveiling before witnesses who cannot be silenced or bought, in a setting where Edmund Hartley cannot simply deny the evidence without exposing himself further. Clara considered this, turning the idea over carefully. The season's closing ball, she said slowly, the one hosted by Lady Fenwick, at the end of the month. Every family of consequence in the city will attend, including the Hartleys. Precisely, the Duke said. If we present this proof there, before the entire city, Edmund Hartley will have no quiet corner to retreat into, no friend powerful enough to make the matter simply disappear before morning. It was a bold plan, and a dangerous one, and Clara felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders even as something fierce and steady rose beneath the fear. Her father's name, restored before the very society that had allowed his ruin to stand unquestioned for 11 years. It was more than she had dared hope for when she first found that unsent letter in the bottom of an old trunk. Over the following weeks, their false engagement began, gradually and almost without her noticing, to feel less false than either of them had intended. The Duke called on her regularly now, not merely for appearances but because the careful work of building their case required constant conference, comparing notes, tracing old business records through solicitors sworn to discretion, verifying the retired clerk's statement against records still held by the bank itself. Clara found herself looking forward to these visits with an eagerness that unsettled her, and one afternoon, working together over a spread of old ledgers in his study, their hands brushed as they both reached for the same page, and neither of them pulled away quite as quickly as propriety demanded. "You are remarkable, you know," the Duke said quietly, still holding the page between them. "Most women raised in your circumstances would have simply accepted their family's ruin, and made whatever peace they could with a diminished life. You have spent weeks chasing down proof of a crime committed against your father, with a precision most solicitors would envy." "I had a great deal of help," Clara said, though warmth rose in her cheeks at the praise. "You had assistance," he corrected gently. "But the persistence, the refusal to simply accept things as they were told to you, that is entirely your own. I find myself quite thoroughly impressed by it, Miss Ashworth, and I do not offer that word lightly." Clara looked up at him, caught by the unguarded warmth in his pale gray eyes, so different from the cold, careful mask he wore in public. "You are not at all what the city believes you to be," she said softly. "They speak of you as though you have no heart at all, and yet I have seen nothing but consideration and care since the night you crossed that ballroom on my behalf." Something shifted in his expression, old guardedness warring with something more vulnerable beneath it. "The city believes what is safest for them to believe," he said. "A man who shows no weakness cannot be exploited through it. I learned that lesson at considerable cost, and I have not forgotten it since." "You mean the woman who betrayed you?" Clara said gently. He nodded, setting the ledger page aside entirely now, his attention fully on her. "Isabel Hartley," he said, the name falling heavily between them. "Priscilla's cousin, as I told you before. We were to be married, some years ago, before I understood that her family had encouraged the match purely to gain influence over my estate, and that Isabel herself cared for the arrangement no more than I ultimately did, once I saw it clearly. I built walls after that, Miss Ashworth, walls I believed necessary for my own protection. I confess I did not expect to find myself questioning their necessity again so soon." Clara's heart quickened at the implication beneath his words, though she hardly dared trust it. "And do you question it now?" "I find," he said slowly, "that I look forward to your visits with an eagerness that has nothing whatsoever to do with old ledgers or unsent letters. I find myself wondering, when we are apart, what you might think of some small thing I have observed, some passage in a book I am reading, some foolishness spoken at a dinner I have attended without you. I did not anticipate this. When I proposed our arrangement in this very room, I am not entirely certain what to do with it now that it has arrived." Clara felt her own breath catch, the careful distance she had maintained between gratitude and something warmer finally giving way beneath the honesty in his voice. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly. "I did not expect to, given everything that brought us together, but I find myself thinking of you far more often than practicality would suggest is wise." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the study quiet around them but for the soft crackle of the fire, and then the Duke reached out and gently took her hand, the same gesture he had offered that first night in the ballroom. but entirely different in its meaning now. "Whatever comes of the ball, whatever becomes of this proof against Edmund Hartley," he said, "I find I no longer wish this engagement to remain merely an appearance, Miss Ashworth. I would ask you to consider whether you might wish the same, once the danger has passed, and you are free to choose without the shadow of Priscilla's threats hanging over the decision." Clara looked at their joined hands, at the careful, unguarded hope in his expression, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that she had not expected to find in the middle of a plot to expose a decade-old fraud. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Once the danger has passed." It was, she reflected later that evening, an oddly practical way to speak of feelings that had grown far beyond practicality, but there was a certain safety in leaving the full weight of it unspoken until the greater danger had been resolved. Priscilla Hartley remained out there, growing more desperate by the week as the closing ball approached, and Clara understood, with sober clarity, that whatever tenderness had grown between herself and the Duke would mean little if Priscilla succeeded in silencing her before the truth could be told. That understanding was confirmed only 2 days later, when Clara returned home from an errand to find her mother's rooms disturbed, drawers left open, papers scattered across the small writing desk where Clara kept what correspondence she retained. Nothing appeared to have been stolen, not the small amount of coin kept in the desk's lower drawer, not her mother's few pieces of modest jewelry. But the search had clearly been thorough and clearly purposeful. "They were looking for the proof," Clara said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear as she surveyed the disorder. "They know we have it, and they came looking while we were both away." She sent word to the Duke immediately, and he arrived within the hour, his expression darkening further as he examined the disturbed room himself. "This was not clumsy," he said. "Whoever searched this room knew precisely what they were looking for, and searched with the confidence of someone who believed they would not be interrupted. This is no longer simply a threat on paper, Miss Ashworth. Priscilla, or more likely her uncle directly, has moved from words to action." "The strongbox is safe," Clara said. "I left it with you, as we agreed." "Then they found nothing," the Duke said, "which means they will grow more desperate, not less. We must move our timeline forward. The closing ball is still 2 weeks away, time enough for them to attempt something far more direct than searching an empty house." Clara felt fear coil tight in her stomach, but beneath it, that same fierce steadiness she had discovered in her uncle's attic held firm. "Then we prepare faster," she said. "Whatever they intend, I would rather face it moving forward than waiting helplessly for their next move." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like pride mixing with concern in his expression. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly. "Very well. We move forward. But from this moment, you do not travel anywhere in this city without protection. I will not risk losing you to Edmund Hartley's desperation, not when we stand so close to finally setting your father's name right, and not when I have only just begun to understand what you have come to mean to me." Clara nodded, accepting the arrangement without argument this time, understanding fully now that the danger surrounding them had grown far beyond a cruel woman's spiteful words in a crowded ballroom. Somewhere across the city, Edmund Hartley was almost certainly calculating his next move, aware now that his years-old secret stood dangerously close to exposure, and willing, it seemed, to take considerable risks to keep it buried. Whatever came next, Clara understood she would not face it alone, and for the first time since her father's death had upended her family's quiet, comfortable life, that certainty felt like something worth holding on to, whatever the danger still ahead. The Duke insisted on moving Clara and her mother into a guest wing of his own townhouse for the remaining fortnight before the ball, a suggestion Margaret initially resisted on grounds of propriety, until the Duke pointed out, with characteristic bluntness, that a ruined reputation mattered a great deal less than a living daughter, and that he intended to see Clara safely to the closing ball whatever the cost to convention. Margaret relented, though she insisted on a chaperone of her own choosing, an elderly cousin named Miss Bell, whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose presence, Clara suspected, was as much a comfort to her mother as it was a guard against scandal. The household settled into a careful new rhythm, solicitors arriving each morning with fresh documents to verify. The strongbox itself kept locked within a hidden compartment of the Duke's own desk, guarded day and night by men the Duke trusted absolutely. In the quiet hours between these preparations, Clara found herself drawn increasingly into easy companionship with the Duke, walks through his private gardens in the early evening, quiet conversations over tea that wandered far from ledgers and legal strategy into simpler things, books they had both read, childhood spent in very different circumstances, small hopes neither of them had spoken aloud to anyone else. "I used to imagine, as a girl, that I would marry for practical reasons alone," Clara admitted one evening, as they walked beneath the last of the autumn leaves, still clinging to the garden's old elms. Security, mostly. A steady household, enough income that my mother would never again have to count coins so carefully. I did not imagine anything more than that was available to someone in my circumstances. And now? The Duke asked, watching her with careful attention. Now I find myself hoping for something I did not believe I was permitted to want, she said softly. Not merely security, but a partner who sees me clearly and values what he sees. I did not expect to find that in a ballroom, on the worst night of my life, standing beside the coldest man in the city. He laughed then, a real laugh, low and warm, a sound Clara realized she had never heard from him before, and it transformed his face entirely, softening the careful sharpness he wore so habitually. The coldest man in the city, he repeated. I shall have to thank Priscilla Hartley for that reputation someday, difficult as that thought is to stomach, since it seems to have served us rather well in the end. Do not thank her yet, Clara said, echoing his own words from that first night. We have not yet won. No, he agreed, his expression sobering. We have not, but we are closer than we were, and closer than Edmund Hartley would like us to be, which is precisely why I intend to keep you close until this matter is fully resolved. As the day of the closing ball approached, the household's preparations intensified. The Duke arranged for a magistrate known for his incorruptibility to be present among the guests, along with 2 solicitors prepared to verify the authenticity of the documents on the spot, should Edmund Hartley attempt to dismiss them as forgeries. Clara spent long hours rehearsing exactly what she would say, how she would present the evidence calmly and clearly, without allowing emotion to undermine the weight of the facts themselves. You must remain composed, the Duke advised, the evening before the ball, as they reviewed the plan one final time in his study. Edmund Hartley will attempt to provoke you, to paint you as vengeful or unstable before the assembled guests, hoping to discredit the evidence through discrediting its bearer. You must not give him that satisfaction. I have had considerable practice remaining composed beneath cruelty, Clara said, thinking of that first terrible night, the wine soaking through her gown, the laughter rippling through the crowd. I do not intend to give either Hartley the satisfaction of watching me break now, not when we stand this close to the truth. The Duke studied her with quiet admiration, reaching out to take her hand once more. Whatever happens tomorrow night, he said, know that I am proud to stand beside you through it, whatever the outcome. You have shown more courage in these past weeks than most men of my acquaintance manage in a lifetime. Clara squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his steady presence, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to imagine the ball's aftermath, her father's name restored, Priscilla's cruelty exposed and answered, and a future beside this unexpectedly gentle man that she had never dared hope to claim for herself. But even as she allowed herself that small comfort, a part of her remained wary, aware that Edmund Hartley had already shown himself willing to search her mother's home, and that a man cornered by exposure rarely surrendered quietly. Whatever tomorrow night held, she suspected it would demand more from both of them than careful words and verified documents alone. Lady Fenwick's ballroom glittered with more candlelight than Clara had ever seen gathered in one place, and for one dizzying moment, standing at the top of the grand staircase with her hand resting on the Duke's arm, she felt the strange symmetry of returning to a room so like the one where this entire ordeal had begun, except this time she descended not as a target, but as something closer to a reckoning. Steady, the Duke murmured, feeling the slight tension in her hand. Whatever happens tonight, you are not alone in it. Clara nodded, drawing a slow breath, and together they descended into the crowd. She spotted Priscilla almost immediately, resplendent in deep emerald silk, holding court near the refreshment table with the same easy confidence she had worn the night she'd struck a glass from a footman's tray and painted the blame onto an innocent woman. Beside her stood a heavy-set man with cold, calculating eyes that Clara recognized, with a lurch of her stomach, from a portrait she had seen among her father's old business papers, Edmund Hartley. The evening proceeded, for its first hour, with deceptive normalcy. Clara danced twice with the Duke, exchanged careful pleasantries with acquaintances who now greeted her with warmth entirely absent from their manner only weeks before, and watched, always from the corner of her eye, as Priscilla and her uncle moved through the crowd, occasionally glancing in her direction with expressions that promised the night was far from finished. It was the Duke who gave the signal, a small nod toward the musicians, who brought their current piece to its natural close, and did not immediately begin another. Into the resulting quiet, the Duke's voice carried clearly across the ballroom, calm and commanding, the same voice that had silenced this same crowd weeks before. Before the evening continues, he said, I would ask the assembled guests for a few moments of their attention, on a matter of some importance to several families present tonight. The crowd's murmur died away entirely, curiosity replacing conversation, and Clara felt every eye in the room turn toward them once more, though this time she did not feel the same helpless shame that had gripped her the last time she stood at the center of such attention. This time she felt something closer to purpose. 11 years ago, the Duke began, a merchant named Charles Ashworth entrusted his savings, along with the savings of several other families in this city, to an investment pool managed by a man well known to many of you. He paused, letting his gaze settle deliberately on Edmund Hartley, whose expression had gone carefully, dangerously still. That pool failed, or so its investors were told. Charles Ashworth died believing himself a fool, having lost his family's security to poor judgment. He was not a fool. He was robbed. A ripple of shocked murmuring spread through the crowd. Priscilla's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence visibly cracking, and Edmund Hartley took a single step forward, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. This is slander, he said. I will not stand here and be accused of theft on the word of a duke chasing scandal to entertain a room. It is not slander, Clara said, stepping forward herself now, her voice steadier than she had dared hope it would be. It is documented fact. She produced the bundle of papers from the small case she had carried all evening, and one of the two solicitors the Duke had arranged stepped forward to receive them, presenting the bank clerk's signed statement and the original ledger to the assembled crowd with careful, deliberate clarity. This ledger, the solicitor announced, his voice carrying easily across the hushed ballroom, documents funds diverted from the investment pool in question into private accounts controlled by Mr. Edmund Hartley, over a period of several months, shortly before the pool's investors were informed of its total failure. This statement, signed and witnessed by the bank clerk who processed those very transfers, corroborates the ledger's account in full. The magistrate, standing quietly near the edge of the gathered crowd, stepped forward now, examining the documents himself with careful, unhurried attention, and the weight of his presence, known throughout the city for his incorruptibility, settled over the room like a verdict already half decided. These documents appear genuine, the magistrate said finally, his voice grave. Mr. Hartley, I would strongly advise you accompany me for further questioning, rather than compound whatever difficulty you already face tonight. Edmund Hartley's composure shattered entirely, his face flushing dark with fury and fear in equal measure. This was orchestrated, he snarled, rounding on Clara with an intensity that made the Duke step protectively closer to her side. This girl and her Duke conspired to ambush me before the entire city, on the strength of papers that could easily be forged. They are not forged, came a new voice, quiet but clear, cutting through the tension, and every head in the room turned toward the unexpected speaker. The retired bank clerk himself, whom the Duke's solicitors had located and quietly brought to the ball as a final, unassailable witness, stepped forward from where he had been waiting near the edges of the crowd. I processed those transfers myself, Mr. Hartley, on your explicit instruction, and I have carried the guilt of my silence for 11 years, believing myself too powerless to speak against a man of your standing. I am no longer willing to carry that guilt in silence. The crowd's murmuring rose into something closer to uproar now, and Clara watched Priscilla's face crumble entirely, the careful cruelty she had worn so easily giving way to something like genuine horror as she understood, perhaps for the first time, the full scope of what her uncle had done, and what her own campaign against Clara had truly been protecting. Priscilla, Clara said, turning toward her former tormentor, and something in her voice made the other woman flinch. You knew, didn't you? Perhaps not everything, but enough. Enough to understand why my father's ruin needed to remain buried, and enough to understand that I might someday uncover the truth of it. Priscilla's composure broke entirely, tears rising in her eyes, though whether from shame or fear, Clara could not tell. I did not know the full truth, she said, her voice cracking. My uncle told me only that your father held a grudge against our family, born of jealousy and failed ambition. He told me you might use that grudge to attempt some scheme against us, and asked me to discredit you before you had the chance. I did not know he had actually stolen from your father. I swear it before everyone here. Whether you knew the full truth or not, the Duke said, his voice hard, you humiliated an innocent woman before an entire ballroom, on nothing more than your uncle's word, without ever pausing to question whether his account might be self-serving. That, Lady Priscilla, is a choice you made freely, whatever ignorance you may claim regarding the rest. The magistrate, satisfied that he had gathered sufficient testimony and evidence for the evening, took Edmund Hartley into custody, amid a swirl of scandalized whispers, the Earl himself arriving moments later, summoned by frantic servants, his face ashen as he attempted, with visibly failing composure, to salvage what remained of his family standing before a crowd that had already witnessed far too much to be easily persuaded otherwise. Clara stood at the center of it all, her father's name finally, publicly restored, and felt an overwhelming wave of emotion crash over her, relief and grief tangled together. 11 years of quiet shame lifted from her family's name in the span of a single evening. It was in the midst of this chaos, as the magistrate's men led Edmund Hartley from the ballroom and the crowd buzzed with 100 urgent whispered theories, that Clara felt a hand close roughly around her arm from behind. "You have ruined everything," Priscilla hissed. Her earlier tears vanished, replaced by something sharper and more desperate. "My family's name, my uncle's freedom, all of it, gone. Because you could not simply accept your father's failure and remain quietly grateful for whatever charity the Duke chose to extend you." "Let go of her," the Duke said, his voice dropping into something dangerously quiet, stepping between them with a speed that startled even Clara. "Or what?" Priscilla demanded, though her grip on Clara's arm loosened slightly under the weight of his glare. "You will humiliate me publicly, as you did before. Go ahead. There is very little left of my reputation for you to destroy tonight, Your Grace. You and this woman have already seen to that quite thoroughly. I did not orchestrate your family's ruin," Clara said quietly, pulling her arm free at last. "Your uncle did that himself, 11 years ago, when he chose to steal from families who trusted him. I only refused to let his lie about my father stand unchallenged any longer. If you wish to blame someone for what has been lost tonight, Lady Priscilla, I would suggest you look first to the man who caused it, rather than the woman who finally exposed it." Priscilla stared at her for a long, charged moment, something shifting behind her eyes that might, in time, have grown into genuine reflection, though Clara doubted it would arrive easily or soon. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the scandalized crowd, leaving Clara standing beside the Duke amid the wreckage of a night that had changed everything. "It is done," the Duke said softly, taking her hand once more. "Your father's name is restored, before witnesses who cannot be bought into silence. Whatever comes next for the Hartley family, it is no longer your burden to carry." Clara looked around the glittering ballroom, at the shocked faces still whispering and staring, and felt, for the first time in 11 long years, that her family's quiet shame had finally been lifted, replaced by something closer to vindication than she had ever dared hope to claim. "Thank you," she said, echoing words she had spoken to him once before, in this very city, on a night that felt impossibly distant now, "for believing me, from the very first moment, when you had no reason at all to trust a stranger's word over an earl's daughter." "I believed you," the Duke said, "because I recognized the truth in your face, even before I understood the full shape of it. I do not regret a single moment of what that belief has cost me, Miss Ashworth. If anything, I find myself only grateful for where it has led us both." Around them, the ball continued its slow return to something resembling normalcy, though the whispers would surely follow this crowd home and spread through every drawing room in the city by morning. But Clara found she did not fear those whispers any longer. For the first time since that terrible night when wine had soaked through her gown and laughter had rippled cruel and cold across a crowded room, she stood in a ballroom feeling not shame, but something steadier and far more lasting. But the night was not yet finished with her. As the crowd began to disperse into smaller clusters of urgent whispering, an older woman Clara did not recognize approached, dressed in severe gray silk, her expression cool and appraising. "Miss Ashworth," the woman said, her voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. "I am Lady Vane, the Duke's aunt. I confess I find myself curious what precisely you intend to gain from this evening's spectacle, beyond your father's restored name." The Duke stiffened beside her. "Aunt Cordelia, this is neither the time nor—" "It is precisely the time," Lady Vane interrupted, "for someone in this family to ask the question everyone else is too polite to voice. You have gone from unknown poor relation to the center of the city's greatest scandal in a matter of weeks, Miss Ashworth, and now stand beside my nephew as though the two of you were genuinely engaged, rather than bound by whatever convenient arrangement first brought you together. Forgive me for wondering whether tonight's triumph serves your father's memory, or your own considerable ambition." The accusation landed like a slap, sharper for the grain of truth twisted cruelly within it, and Clara felt heat rise in her face, old shame threatening to resurface beneath this new, more sophisticated cruelty. She glanced at the Duke and saw, to her dismay, a flicker of uncertainty cross his features before he could master it, quick and involuntary. but not quick enough to escape her notice entirely. "You doubt me," Clara said quietly, the words landing somewhere between question and accusation. "I do not doubt you," the Duke said quickly, though his voice carried a fraction less certainty than she needed to hear in that moment. "My aunt speaks carelessly, Clara. She does not know you as I have come to know you these past weeks." "But you hesitated," Clara said, the ballroom around them fading into distant noise as she focused entirely on his face. "Just now, when she accused me of ambition, you hesitated before you answered her." "I was startled," he said, not doubtful. "There is a difference, Miss Ashworth, and I would ask you not to conflate the two simply because my aunt has chosen tonight, of all nights, to voice her suspicions so bluntly." But the seed of doubt, once planted, proved difficult to uproot entirely, and Clara felt the warmth of the evening's earlier triumph cooling into something more uncertain. She thought of every calculating glance she had received since her engagement to the Duke had been announced, every whispered suggestion that a poor relation might have engineered her own rescue for exactly the advancement Lady Vane now accused her of seeking. She had told herself those whispers did not matter, that she knew her own heart even if the city did not, but hearing the accusation voiced so plainly, by a woman who knew the Duke far better than Clara herself did, shook something loose that she had not realized still stood so precariously balanced. "Perhaps," Clara said slowly, stepping back from him, "we should continue this conversation another time, away from so many watching eyes." "Clara, please," she said, and something in her voice must have carried enough weight that he did not press further, though the concern in his expression deepened visibly. "I need a moment, Your Grace. Only a moment." She retreated toward the edge of the ballroom, finding a quiet alcove behind a bank of tall potted ferns, and pressed a hand to her chest, willing her racing heart to steady. She did not truly believe the Duke doubted her, not in the depths of her own understanding of the weeks they had spent together, the honesty he had shown her, the vulnerability of his confession about Isabel Hartley's betrayal. But Lady Vane's accusation had struck at a fear Clara had not fully acknowledged even to herself, the worry that whatever grew between them might always be shadowed by questions of what she stood to gain from it, that she might never entirely escape the suspicion of having orchestrated her own rescue for personal advancement. It was several minutes before the Duke found her there, his expression troubled in a way she had rarely seen since that very first night. "I am sorry," he said simply, without preamble. "My aunt has always guarded my interests fiercely, sometimes too fiercely for tact or kindness, and I should have answered her more firmly, without even that momentary hesitation you noticed. You deserved better from me tonight, after everything you have carried and overcome." Clara studied his face, searching for any remaining trace of the doubt she had glimpsed, and found only genuine regret. "I do not fear your aunt's suspicion," she said slowly. "I fear my own, if I am honest. I have spent so many years being told what I was owed and was not owed, what I could hope for and could not, that some part of me still expects every good thing to be revealed, eventually, as a mistake or a manipulation. I did not realize how deeply that fear still lived in me until tonight. Then let me say plainly, before anyone else in this city, so there can be no further doubt," the Duke said, taking both her hands in his, "I do not care what my aunt believes, or what whispers follow us home tonight. I have watched you fight for your father's name with more courage than I have seen from men twice your age and considerably more power. Whatever this began as, Clara, it is no longer an arrangement of convenience to me. It has not been for weeks. I love you, plainly and entirely, and I will say so before my aunt, before this ballroom, before the whole city if it will finally put your doubts to rest." Clara felt tears rise, sharp and sudden, though this time they carried no shame at all. "You do not need to shout it to the whole ballroom," she said, a small, unsteady laugh breaking through the emotion. "I believe you." "Good," he said, some of the tension easing from his shoulders at last, "because I meant every word of it. You." Around them, the ball continued its slow return to something resembling normalcy, though the whispers would surely follow this crowd home, and spread through every drawing room in the city by morning. But Clara found she did not fear those whispers any longer. For the first time since that terrible night when wine had soaked through her gown and laughter had rippled cruel and cold across a crowded room, she stood in a ballroom feeling not shame, but something steadier and far more lasting. She stood there feeling, at last, entirely herself. 3 weeks after the closing ball, the city had not stopped speaking of that night, and Clara had grown almost accustomed to the stares that followed her now wherever she went, no longer cruel or dismissive, but curious, admiring, occasionally even envious. It was a strange thing, she reflected, to become the subject of fascination rather than mockery in the span of a single evening, and stranger still to realize how quickly she had adjusted to the change. Edmund Hartley remained in custody, awaiting a formal trial that promised to be the talk of the city for months to come. His brother, the Earl, having withdrawn almost entirely from society in the weeks since, unable to salvage what remained of the family's standing amid the scandal. Priscilla, Clara had heard through careful channels, had retreated to a distant country estate with her mother, her own reputation too tangled in her uncle's disgrace to survive a full season in the capital. Clara felt no particular satisfaction in Priscilla's downfall, though she could not entirely muster sympathy for it either. The other woman had made her choices, cruel and careless ones, built on assumptions she had never bothered to question, and the consequences of those choices belonged to her alone to carry. What occupied Clara's thoughts far more consistently, in the weeks since the ball, was the quiet, steady happiness that had grown between herself and the Duke, no longer shadowed by the uncertainty of a false arrangement or the looming threat of the Hartley schemes. He called on her nearly every day now, and she had grown to know him in ways she could not have imagined possible on that first terrible night. His dry humor once he trusted someone enough to show it, his genuine tenderness toward the servants and tenants who depended on him, the careful, unhurried patience he brought to every difficult conversation, a patience Clara suspected had been hard-won through years of guarding himself against people who did not deserve his trust. It was on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks and 4 days after the closing ball, that he called on her mother's small rented rooms, rather than sending his carriage as he usually did, arriving instead on foot, dressed with unusual formality, a small velvet box carried carefully in his coat pocket. Margaret Ashworth answered the door herself, and something in the Duke's expression must have told her immediately what he intended, because she stepped back with a knowing smile and called for Clara before he had even finished his greeting. Clara came down the narrow stairs to find him standing in their modest sitting room, looking entirely out of place amid the small, careful furnishings of a household that had spent 11 years counting every coin, and yet somehow entirely at ease there as well, as though the room's modesty mattered to him not at all. "Your Grace," she said, surprised, "I did not expect you until this evening." "I could not wait until this evening," he said, and something in his voice, uncharacteristically unsteady, made her heart quicken with sudden understanding. "Clara, I have spent these past weeks turning over exactly the right words for this moment, and I find, now that I stand here, that none of the speeches I prepared feel adequate to what I actually wish to say." He crossed the small room and took her hands, and Clara felt her mother retreat quietly to the doorway, giving them what privacy the small space allowed. "When I crossed that ballroom weeks ago," he said, "I told myself I was acting on principle alone, refusing to let a lie stand unchallenged, simply because the room found it convenient to believe. I did not expect that the woman I stepped forward to defend would become the person I could not imagine my life without. I did not expect to find, in you, someone who meets cruelty with courage rather than despair, who chases the truth even when silence would be far safer, who has shown me more genuine warmth and honesty in a few short weeks than I received from most of society across an entire lifetime." He lowered himself to one knee then, and Clara felt her breath catch entirely, tears already rising as he opened the small velvet box to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious jewels she had seen displayed at every ball she'd attended since, but exactly, precisely right for the quiet, steady love that had grown between them. "Clara Ashworth," he said, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not in appearance, not for protection or convenience, but in truth, before your family, before mine, before the entire city that first watched us together as strangers, and now, I hope, might watch us as something far more lasting." Clara did not trust her voice for a long moment, overwhelmed by the swift, dizzying joy of a moment she had never quite let herself imagine. Not truly, not since that terrible night when humiliation had seemed the only future waiting for her in that glittering, unforgiving world. "Yes," she finally managed, the word breaking slightly with emotion. "Yes, Alaric, entirely yes." He rose and drew her into his arms, and behind them, Clara heard her mother's soft, joyful exclamation, and felt, for the first time in 11 long years, that her family's future stretched ahead, not in careful, anxious calculation, but in genuine, unguarded hope. 2 weeks before the wedding, word arrived that Edmund Hartley's trial had concluded. The verdict returned swiftly, given the weight of evidence presented against him. He was found guilty of fraud against multiple families, stripped of what remained of his personal fortune to provide restitution to his victims, and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that the magistrate declared, in his closing remarks, fitting for a man who had allowed an innocent family to bear the shame of his own crimes for over a decade. Clara received the news quietly, sitting in the Duke's study where so much of this journey had begun, and found herself surprised by the calm that settled over her, rather than any fierce satisfaction she might once have expected to feel. "I thought I would feel triumphant," she admitted to the Duke, who sat beside her, "but mostly, I simply feel relieved, as though a door that has stood locked for 11 years has finally been allowed to close properly, rather than continuing to hang open on rusted hinges." "That is its own kind of triumph," the Duke said gently. "Not vengeance, but resolution. Your father would have wanted peace for you and your mother, far more than he would have wanted retribution for himself." Restitution funds, though modest given how thoroughly Edmund Hartley had already spent what he stole, were distributed among the families he had defrauded, and Margaret Ashworth received enough to finally leave the small rented rooms she had called home for over a decade, though she insisted, with quiet pride, on choosing a modest house rather than anything grander, telling Clara she had grown fond of simplicity and saw no reason to abandon it now that circumstances allowed otherwise. With that final matter settled, the wedding preparations resumed in earnest, and Clara found herself swept into the particular whirlwind of dress fittings, guest lists, and careful negotiations between the Duke's household staff and her mother's far more modest sensibilities regarding what such an occasion required. Through it all, the Duke remained a steady, reassuring presence, more concerned with Clara's happiness than with any grand display society might have expected of a man in his position. "I do not care what the city expects of this wedding," he told her, during one particularly overwhelming afternoon of competing opinions from his aunt, his housekeeper, and Clara's mother all at once. "I care only that you feel it is truly yours, and truly ours, rather than another performance staged for an audience we no longer owe anything to." Lady Vane, to Clara's quiet surprise, had softened considerably in the weeks since the closing ball, her earlier suspicion giving way, gradually, to something like genuine respect once she witnessed firsthand the steady devotion between her nephew and his intended bride. She called on Clara privately one afternoon, without the Duke present, and offered what Clara understood, from a woman of her reserved temperament, to be a rare and heartfelt apology. "I misjudged you that night," Lady Vane said, without excessive ceremony. "I have watched my nephew guard himself so carefully, for so many years, that I grew suspicious of anyone who seemed to breach those walls too easily. I see now that you did not breach them easily at all, Miss Ashworth. You earned his trust through considerable courage and considerable cost, and I was wrong to suggest otherwise before an entire ballroom. I hope you can forgive an old woman's overprotective instincts." Clara accepted the apology graciously, understanding the particular vulnerability required for a woman like Lady Vane to offer it at all, and found, in the weeks that followed, that she had gained not merely a husband but an entire family willing to embrace her fully, quite unlike the careful, conditional acceptance she had grown accustomed to receiving from society at large. Their wedding, when it came 6 weeks later, was a smaller affair than society expected of a duke, held in the same church where the Duke's own parents had married decades before, attended by family, and the small circle of true friends they had each gathered across their very different lives. Clara wore a gown of pale blue silk, nothing like the ruined dress that had marked the worst night of her life, and walked down the aisle toward a man who had once been known throughout the city only for his coldness, and who now looked at her with a warmth so plain and unguarded that several guests remarked afterward they had scarcely recognized him. Margaret Ashworth wept openly through the entire ceremony, and afterward, at the modest wedding breakfast that followed, pulled Clara aside for a quiet moment amid the celebration. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly, pressing Clara's hands between her own. "Not merely of this marriage, though I know he would have approved of the Duke entirely, once he came to know him as we have. He would be proud of everything you did to restore his name, to prove that his final years of quiet shame were never truly deserved. You gave him back something I feared was lost forever, Clara. You gave us both back our peace." Clara embraced her mother, feeling the last lingering weight of 11 years' grief finally settle into something gentler, something closer to acceptance than sorrow. Her father's name stood restored throughout the city now, spoken with sympathy rather than quiet pity, and though he had not lived to see this day, Clara found comfort in believing he somehow knew, wherever he rested, that his silence and sacrifice had not been for nothing after all. Months later, settled into her new life as Duchess of Camden, Clara found herself once more in a grand ballroom, though this one belonged to her now, hosting her first great gathering as the Duke's wife. She stood at the top of the same kind of grand staircase where humiliation had once waited for her, and felt nothing but calm as she descended into the glittering crowd below, her husband's arm steady beneath her hand, exactly as it had been on that very first night. A young woman near the refreshment table caught her eye, standing alone at the edge of the gathering, watching the swirl of confident, established guests with the particular wariness of someone who did not quite believe she belonged among them. Clara recognized that expression immediately, having worn it herself not so very long ago, and excused herself from her husband's side to cross the room toward the stranger. "You look as though you could use a friend this evening," Clara said gently, offering her hand. "I am Clara Vane. I promise you, this room is far less intimidating than it appears, once you know a few kind faces within it." The young woman's shoulders relaxed slightly, gratitude flickering across features drawn tight with anxiety. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I confess I feel rather out of place among such company." "I felt exactly the same way not so long ago," Clara said, and meant it entirely, the memory of that terrible night no longer painful to recall, transformed instead into something closer to gratitude for everything it had ultimately led her toward. "Come, let me introduce you properly, and we shall see this room welcomes you far more warmly than you expect." As she led the young woman across the ballroom floor, Clara caught her husband's eye across the crowd, watching her with quiet, unguarded pride, and felt the full, settled warmth of everything they had built together since that first chaotic, humiliating night, a warmth built not on convenience or calculation, but on courage, honesty, and a love that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any cruelty the world had tried to wield against it. Whatever ballroom still awaited her in the years ahead, Clara understood now, with quiet, unshakable certainty, that she would never again stand in one feeling unworthy of her place within it. She had fought for her father's name, found love in the most unlikely of circumstances, and become, in the process, exactly the woman she had always hoped, in her quietest and most private moments, that she might someday become. Later that evening, once the last of the guests had departed, and the grand ballroom stood quiet once more, Clara and her husband walked together through the empty hall, candles still burning low in their sconces, the faint echo of music still seeming to linger in the vast, silent space. "Do you remember," Alaric said, drawing her close as they paused beneath the same tall windows where she had once longed to disappear into the dark garden beyond, "what I told you, that very first night, when you thanked me for stepping in on your behalf?" "You told me not to thank you yet," Clara said, smiling at the memory, "because I did not yet know what I had agreed to." "And do you know now?" he asked, searching her face with the same quiet intensity she had come to treasure in him. Clara considered the question seriously, thinking back over everything the past months had brought her, the humiliation and the vindication, the fear and the courage it had demanded of her, the slow, unexpected unfolding of love in the midst of danger and uncertainty. "I know that I agreed to far more than protection that night," she said finally. "I agreed to a partnership with a man who saw me clearly before the rest of the world ever bothered to look. I agreed to fight for the truth, and to be fought for in return. I would not change a single moment of it, even the hardest ones, because they led me here, to this exact life, beside you." "Even the wine on your gown?" he asked, a teasing warmth in his voice that she had grown to love dearly. "Even the wine," she said, laughing softly, "though I confess I have never quite forgiven that particular shade of silk." He laughed too, the sound rich and unguarded in the empty ballroom, and drew her into a slow, quiet dance without any music at all, just the two of them turning gently beneath the tall windows where her humiliation had once seemed absolute, and where, in the end, an entirely different story had been written instead. "I love you, Clara Vane," he murmured against her hair, "not the version of you the ballroom tried to shame that first night, and not the version society now admires for surviving it. I love the whole of you, courage and fear and everything between, exactly as you are." "And I love you," Clara answered, resting her head against his shoulder as they moved slowly through the quiet hall. "The whole of you as well. The coldness the city once feared, and the warmth you have shown only to those who earned the right to see it. I am glad, more than I can say, that I was one of them." Outside, the last carriages rolled away into the night, carrying with them 100 fresh whispers that would circulate through the city's drawing rooms for weeks to come. Tales of the Duchess who had once been humiliated in this very ballroom, and now ruled it with quiet, unshakable grace. But within the hall itself, none of that mattered any longer. There was only the soft glow of candlelight, the gentle rhythm of an unheard dance, and two people who had found, against every expectation either of them once carried, exactly the kind of steady, hard-won love that outlasts every cruel whisper a crowded room can offer. And as the music swelled once more through the grand hall, and her husband crossed the room to claim her hand for the next dance, Clara Vane, Duchess of Camden, allowed herself, at last, to simply be happy. A year after the wedding, a letter arrived at the Duke's townhouse bearing a seal Clara did not immediately recognize, plain and unadorned, sent from a small coastal town several days' journey from the capital. She almost set it aside among the household's ordinary correspondence, until she noticed the handwriting on the front, familiar despite how long it had been since she had last seen it. Priscilla Hartley. Clara sat with the letter for a long while before opening it, turning it over in her hands, remembering the woman who had once circled her in a crowded ballroom with such casual cruelty, and the frightened, uncertain figure she had become by the end of that terrible reckoning at Lady Fenwick's ball. She had heard little of Priscilla since, only that she had retreated with her mother to live quietly away from society. Her prospects and her reputation both diminished beyond easy repair. She broke the seal and read. "Your Grace," the letter began, formal despite its content. "I do not know if this letter will find welcome, and I would not blame you if you chose to burn it unread. I have thought of writing to you many times over this past year, and have lost my courage just as many times before finally forcing myself to see it through. I have had a great deal of time these past months to consider my own choices, away from the city and the influence of my uncle, whose crimes I have come to understand far more fully than I allowed myself to at the time. I told myself, that night in the ballroom, that I was simply defending my family's honor against an unknown threat. The truth, which I have only recently found the honesty to face, is that I chose cruelty because it was easier than questioning the people I trusted, and because I had grown accustomed to a world where kindness toward those beneath my station cost me nothing to withhold. I am not writing to ask your forgiveness, though I would not refuse it if you found yourself able to offer it. I am writing because I have taken a position, these past months, teaching young women at a small charity school in this town, women whose circumstances resemble the poverty and precariousness I once mocked so carelessly in you, without ever pausing to imagine what such a life might actually demand of a person. I find the work humbling in ways I did not expect, and I find myself, more often than I would like to admit, thinking of the courage you showed that night, standing beneath my cruelty without breaking, and wondering whether I might someday earn even a fraction of that same courage for myself. I do not expect a reply. I only wished you to know that your example, however painful its cost to you at the time, changed something in me that I am only now beginning to properly understand. With whatever regard I still have any right to claim, Priscilla Hartley." Clara read the letter twice more before setting it down, feeling a complicated tangle of emotions she had not expected to feel toward the woman who had once humiliated her so thoroughly before an entire ballroom. Not quite forgiveness, not entirely. The wound had been real, and the scars from it had taken considerable time to fade, but something softer than lingering resentment, a recognition, perhaps, that people were capable of change when circumstances finally forced them to look honestly at themselves. She brought the letter to Alaric that evening, watching his expression carefully as he read it, uncertain what reaction to expect from a man who had far more reason than she did to hold the Hartley name in contempt. "What will you do?" he asked, once he had finished reading, handing the letter back to her with careful consideration rather than immediate judgment. "I am not certain," Clara admitted. "Part of me wants to leave the letter unanswered, to let that chapter of our lives remain closed, exactly as we left it that night. But another part of me remembers what it felt like to be judged entirely by my worst circumstances, without anyone pausing to wonder whether I might become something more than what those circumstances suggested. I do not know that Priscilla deserves my forgiveness, but I find I do not wish to deny her the chance to prove she has genuinely changed either." "That," Alaric said, drawing her close, "sounds very much like the same courage that first drew me to you, standing in that ballroom, refusing to let cruelty define you entirely. If you wish to answer her, I will not stand in your way, whatever complicated history lies between our families. I trust your judgment in this, as I have learned to trust it in everything else." Clara considered the matter for several days before finally sitting down to write her reply, choosing her words with the same careful deliberation she had once brought to compiling evidence against Priscilla's uncle. She did not offer easy forgiveness, nor did she pretend the wound of that first humiliation had entirely healed. But she acknowledged the courage it must have taken to write such a letter, and expressed a cautious, guarded hope that the work Priscilla had found for herself might continue to shape her into someone genuinely changed, rather than merely someone chastened by consequence. She did not expect further correspondence, and for several months, none came. But nearly a year later, a small parcel arrived at the townhouse, containing a modest, carefully embroidered handkerchief and a brief note explaining that it had been stitched by one of the young women at Priscilla's charity school. A girl who had arrived at the school with nothing, much as Clara herself had once arrived at a ballroom with little beyond her mother's careful hopes, and who had asked, upon hearing something of Clara's own story from Priscilla, whether she might make something to send in gratitude for the example that had, indirectly, changed the course of her own education. Clara kept that handkerchief in a small box on her writing desk for years afterward, a quiet reminder that even the ugliest beginnings could sometimes, given enough courage and enough time, unfold into something unexpectedly good. Life at the Duke's estate settled, over that first year, into a rhythm Clara had never quite dared imagine for herself during the long, careful years of her family's diminished circumstances. She oversaw the household with growing confidence, developed a genuine fondness for the tenants and staff who had initially regarded their new duchess with cautious curiosity, and found, much to her own surprise, a particular talent for the quiet diplomatic work of smoothing over the small disputes and negotiations that inevitably arose across a large estate. Her mother visited often, delighting in grandchildren who arrived, in time, to fill the once quiet halls of the Duke's country house with laughter, and small, chaotic joys neither Clara nor Alaric had fully anticipated, but came to treasure completely. Margaret Ashworth, who had spent so many years counting careful coins and worrying over her daughter's uncertain future, lived to see that future secured beyond anything she had once dared to hope for, and told Clara often, in her quieter moments, that she had never imagined such complete happiness could grow from such a painful beginning. As for Alaric, the city's opinion of him shifted gradually over those years, the cold, feared Duke of old rumor giving way, slowly, to a man widely regarded as fiercely loyal to those he loved, generous to those who depended on him, and devoted, above all else, to the wife who had first captured his guarded heart on the worst night of her own life. He never fully lost the sharp, watchful edge that had made him so formidable in his younger years, but Clara came to understand that edge not as coldness, but as the hard-won armor of a man who had learned, at great cost, exactly how much protecting the people he loved could matter. Years later, when their eldest daughter asked, as children eventually do, how her parents had first met, Clara would tell the story with a warmth that had long since replaced any lingering pain, describing a crowded ballroom, a glass of spilled wine, and the coldest, most feared man in the entire city, who had crossed that glittering floor without hesitation to stand beside a stranger the whole world had turned against. "Were you frightened?" her daughter would always ask at this point in the telling, wide-eyed at the thought of her steady, unshakable mother ever having felt so small and alone. "Terribly," Clara would answer honestly. "But your father taught me something important that night, something I have carried with me ever since. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear, even when the whole room seems determined to make you feel as though you should." And every time she told the story, standing in the same grand hall where it had all truly begun, Clara felt nothing but gratitude for the winding, difficult path that had led her there, to a life built not on the fragile foundation of convenient appearances, but on courage, honesty, and a love that had proven, in the end, far stronger than any cruelty a crowded ballroom had ever tried to wield against her. There was, too, a small tradition that grew from that story over the years, one Clara had never planned but came to cherish deeply. Each season, when the great houses of the city opened their doors for the first grand ball of the year, Clara made a quiet habit of seeking out whichever young woman seemed most uncertain among the crowd, the one standing slightly apart, watching the glittering room with the particular wariness of someone who did not yet believe she belonged. She would cross the floor, offer a warm word and a steady hand, and stay close enough through the evening to ensure that no cruelty, however carelessly delivered, could take root unanswered in that young woman's night. Alaric often watched her do this from across whatever ballroom they found themselves in, a quiet, private smile touching his face each time, and more than once he found himself drawn into the effort as well, extending the same steady protection he had once offered a frightened stranger to whichever nervous young man or overlooked guest seemed most in need of it. Their household, and eventually their circle of friends, grew known throughout the city for a particular kind of quiet kindness, an instinct for noticing who stood unseen at the edges of a crowded room, and drawing them gently toward its center. "We were both once exactly that person," Alaric said to her once, watching her guide a trembling young debutante through her first difficult conversation with a particularly sharp-tongued dowager. "It seems only right that we spend the rest of our years making certain fewer people have to stand alone the way we once did." Clara agreed entirely, and found, in that quiet purpose, one more thread binding their marriage together, beyond the passion and partnership that had first drawn them close. They had both known what it meant to be dismissed, judged and diminished by a world quick to mistake circumstance for character. And they had both been given, through nothing but chance and each other's stubborn courage, the rare opportunity to build something better from those painful beginnings. The ballroom that had once seen Clara's deepest humiliation became, in time, the very place where her own quiet legacy of kindness took root and grew, spreading outward through 100 small, unremarked kindnesses that never made the whispered gossip of the city, but that changed, quietly and completely, the lives of everyone fortunate enough to receive them. It was not the ending Clara could have imagined for herself on that terrible first night, wine soaking cold through her ruined gown. It was, she often thought, something far better than anything she could have dared to hope for at all.